Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Harris.
Thank you, and I want to thank the Chairman and Vice Chairman for this open hearing. As this committee conducts its investigation into the Russia's interference with our 2016 United States election, the American people need to fully understand the threat that we face and what we must do to protect ourselves in the future. And let's all be clear about what happened. We know, as has already been determined by the CIA, the FBI, and the NSA, a foreign country, Russia, attacked the heart of our democracy, an American election for the President of the United States. And they can and will do so again if we do not act urgently. We must get to the bottom of this. We must be thorough, we must proceed with urgency, and we must be transparent. That is vital to protect the public's trust in us, and it's what the American people deserve. And I know we can do so while protecting classified sources and material. Items that must remain classified in order to protect our national security, the sources of our intelligence, and the sensitive methods by which we collect it. This hearing is a first step to understand Russia's interference, but it cannot end here. We must build on today's hearing with future open hearings as much as possible. And I strongly believe an informed public is one of our best weapons against future attacks. That being said, I have a question for all of you, and I'll start with Mr. Watts. Earlier this week, former President Vice President Cheney said Russia's interference in our election should be considered an act of war. Assuming this was an act of war, Russia is investing in cyber weapons and cyber soldiers, which we call trolls, while we continue to invest in conventional weapons. As we invest in fighter jets and aircraft carriers, Russia is investing in state-run media from which it can push out fake news. As we consider investing more than $600 billion in our defense budget, Russia has approximately 1/10 of that amount in their budget and is developing its cyber warfare capabilities. I strongly believe cyber may be the new frontier of war. And so my question for you is, was this an act of war? And are we prepared for this new form of warfare? And equally important, given the everyday challenges of Americans in their everyday lives, why should they be concerned about this?
On the first part, an act of war, on the scale of warfare, it's not kinetic, but it's definitely part of the Cold War system that we knew 20, 30 years ago. Americans should be concerned because right now, a foreign country, whether they realize it or not, is pitting them against their neighbor, other political parties, ramping up divisions based on things that aren't true. They're trying to break down the trust they have in you as a senator, the Congress, the legislature, the court system. They're trying to break down all faith in those institutions. And if they can do that, if Americans don't believe that their vote counts, they're not going to show up to participate in democracy. If they don't believe that what they're doing is part of a government system that actually represents them, they're not going to go to jury duty. If they don't believe in those institutions, everything breaks down. And when that breakdown occurs, we are focused internally, and Russia is focused externally, achieving their goals. In terms of investments, part of the reason we don't invest well in cyber and we don't invest in information is because we're not buying big pieces of equipment. If you can't buy a big piece of equipment, then it's really hard to invest your dollars. We need to invest in people. The reason Russians win in cyber and information space is they have great propagandists and they have the best hackers that are out there that they can either enlist because they're criminals and sort of bring under their umbrella or train themselves. We, on the other hand, worry a lot about who we're going to bring into the cyber field because they might have smoked weed one day, or they can't pass a security clearance, or they didn't get a score on their ASVAB. But there's millions, I mean millions of talented Americans out there that can support these roles inside our government. We need to invest in humans moving forward in this space. And it's hard to get Americans to understand that, or even the Department of Defense, because you're talking about cyber and computers, and so you think of tech. But the truth is that tech only works if you've got the smartest brains behind it. We do, but we don't put them against our fight.
Thank you. Dr. Rumer.
I think we should be careful using terms such as an act of war. It's definitely a continuation of warfare by other means. But, when you declare something to be an act of war, it calls for certain responses that we may not be ready to take on. I do agree with Mr. Watts on the need to be much more creative and much more resourceful in a way we approach the question of, call it cyber warfare. I, again, would caution that, the Russians have a very different standard here in using their offensive tools than we use in using our cyber tools with great deal of responsibility. And I think we should be very careful not to cross certain lines. We should, however, be using tools that are available to us and platforms that are available to us, just from a somewhat different domain. I think that our own spokesman, our own information projected, delivered from our platforms should be the gold standard of accuracy and objectivity. So from that standpoint, let me just say that, we're not using, for example, the platform of the State Department effectively. The practice of not sustaining our regular briefings for the media, for the world, is something that only hurts our interests.
Thank you.
I agree with my colleagues, so I won't repeat the same conclusions they reached. I would, though, like to introduce the idea, though, that cyber is now important. Cyber wasn't considered so important 20 years ago, now considered important. But there are other technologies coming on board now. Some are visible to us. Some they're not very salient. They haven't risen above the horizon. There are a whole number of technologies that are not internet dependent. And as we look at active measures now and into the future, I would think that would be on the agenda. I'll give just one example, virtual reality. Anybody who can set up the reality is going to have a very decided advantage in politics and other areas. And so as we're looking at cyber, and you are going to have a hearing and other studies of this, I would say just that we should broaden the concept of technologies that are going to be available, coming online, and it's be extremely unlikely that the Russians would ignore those technologies. And so maybe that would be something to add to the already busy agenda that you have. And thank you.
Thank you, Senator
Thank you.
Harris. Thank you to all of our witnesses. All the questions have been asked except for mine. So let me, if I could, spend just a couple of minutes. And I agree with you, Dr. Godson. The ability to impersonate online is the next phase that we will go through. And I think it's safe to say we don't have our best and brightest yet focused on that. We're still trying to triage what happened to us versus to be creative and look forward and say what could happen. Mr. Watts, I heard you talk about intent and specifically the intent of the Russians and their effectiveness, and how pre-planning played a large part of the 16 effort. Here's my disconnect, is that when you, at least on the surface as we've gotten into the investigation, as you look at the emails that were captured either out of the DNC or out of the Podesta account that were then the source of Russia's effort through WikiLeaks to publicly lay this out. That seemed to be an average, ordinary Russian fishing expedition that we captured maybe 3,000 efforts at the same period in time. So are you suggesting that they had an effort to mess with the elections and just happened to be lucky enough to stumble across a volume of emails?
They go widespread. Whatever are the best nuggets that come out of that is what they run with. They hit a gold mine, and they were able to successfully find the ammunition they wanted. What you see at other cases is they do compromise other accounts. I'm not going to talk about them. I don't want to amplify them, but they're less successful. You know, we'll hear dumps, and you'll be like, oh, this isn't really anything other than what I expected a politician to say. And so they hit a whale whenever they went fishing. But I would also say that somewhere in their cache right now, there's tremendous amounts of information laying around that can weaponize against other Americans.
We would agree with you on that. And very quickly, as you sort of summarized how fake news and how coordinated social media efforts push stories to the top 10 and they get picked up automatically. What is the takeaway for U.S. media outlets from what you've just said?
They have to improve their editorial processes, and they also have to take a step back from the "I got to get it out first" competitive environment. Part of the reason this Russian system works is every outlet races to get the story out first. When they do that, they put themselves at risk to fall for these sorts of schemes. And until they improve that, or until they collectively, we have some sort of standard that either the public or the media holds to itself, we're going to keep seeing them fall for these campaigns, whether it's Russia, by the way, or others.
Sure.
You're going to see many other nations take this on now. The playbook's been thrown out there.
Dr. Rumer, would you like to take the opportunity to address in greater detail what the Russians are doing in the French and German elections?
Well, sir, there's a wide effort in the German election to build up this far-right party, Alternative for Germany, ADF, to use them as sort of a credible challenger to Chancellor Angela Merkel. There are countless stories that are being spread through fake news sites, proliferating in the media about the failures of Chancellor Merkel. They, as others have pointed out, have exploited the story about the girl that was not raped, but to again discredit her in the eyes of the general public, so as to point out her failure to protect Germany against the flood of refugees. That's one of the major policy initiatives that she took when the Syria crisis broke out. In the French election, we just saw something that really was staggering, and that is President Putin hosted in the Kremlin the leading far-right candidate, and almost with a smirk said that we don't interfere in French elections, but we have the right to engage any candidate in the public domain in that contest. Also, Russian disinformation sources have spread malicious stories about one of the leading candidates, Emmanuel Macron, about his personal life. So
for the first time, we're really beginning to see an effort to build up and to absolutely destroy the character of others, having a double impact on potentially on the outcome of the election.
yes, sir.
Good. Dr. Godson, just quickly, how did we respond differently when we overcame these active measures by Russians pre-80? And is there a lesson for us to learn from that interactions now?
I think there are a number of lessons, but one was this exposure business, that we learned how to put out information into the public domain that not only was relevant for Americans, but for foreigners. And we briefed that, and we developed teams that could go out and talk about these things, and so neutralize a lot. That was one of the methods that we could replicate. A second was support to elements abroad who are trying to maintain the democratic process. We developed some capabilities to do that. We still have some. One of the outstanding examples is the National Endowment for Democracy, bipartisan, able to do quite a lot, but is also limited in various ways. And so one could look back and see how we were able to do this in different ways abroad that had an effect in the past. It's not that expensive financially.
Sure.
And those methods are available.
Thank you. Mr. Watts, just very briefly, has anybody taken you up on your list of recommendations?
No.
Okay. That did not go unnoticed by the committee. I want you to know that. And nor did the comment that there was agreement on at the table that America's response to date has been woefully short of what it should be. If anything, it should be interpreted, and it probably was interpreted by the Russians, that they can double down and, in fact, do it unscathed. So, Mr. Watts, we heard you when you said fact and fiction have become wildly blurred. Let me just assure you that this committee's mission every day is to do the oversight on the intelligence community, 17 agencies, that assures the American people we do everything within the letter of the law. We first assure that to 85 other members of the Senate. So when it came time for a look inside what Russia active measures did and what our response was and how our intelligence community came to the assessments that they would, this fell right in our wheelhouse. This is what our professional staff does on a daily basis. This is a little more granular than what we do. It will take some time, and it means triaging a tremendous amount of documents. But I also heard from all three of you that if there was ever a time to get it right, it's now. And we have methodically built a process that builds a foundation of fact to build an investigation on that foundation that can hopefully come to a bipartisan finding where the conclusions are matched with the facts that we find. In some cases, as all three of you know, that might be intelligence product that can't be made public. But in every place that we can, I have pledged to the Vice Chairman, and he has pledged to his members, and I have pledged to mine, where we can make it public so that the American people understand it and feel that this has been credible and thorough and that the conclusions are valid, we're going to try to do that. But I also believe that the American people expect us to protect sources and methods. They expect us to work with the intelligence community in a way that strengthens what they do and how they do it, not by sharing that with everybody, but by certifying that they're doing it within the letter of the law to keep America safe. I look at this investigation as one extension of that, and it's to once again certify to the American people what we've done has been thorough, to hopefully provide some actionable conclusions for this administration, and to look back on the work that we do and believe that in 2018, 2020, we're going to be less concerned with Russia's involvement in our elections, and that the United States of America should, like we do on terrorism, work with any country in the world that might be the target of an aggressor like Vladimir Putin. So I'm grateful to you for what you've contributed to our investigation. This hearing's now adjourned.
Pretty good.